good afternoon or good evening, depending on where it is you're listening. This is Dan Turchin, host of AI and the Future of Work and CEO of PeopleRain, an AI-first platform for IT and HR employee service. If you enjoy the podcast, subscribe to our newsletter. It's at peoplerain.io/podcast. That's PeopleRain, like the reign of a king, REIGN.io/podcast to get bonus content and additional insights from past guests. As you know, we talk about the future of work on this podcast, but one of the topics we haven't covered is what it's like to be an employee and have to navigate the complex process of going on leave, whether that's maternity, paternity, medical, or any other type. Today's guest was inspired by the idea that employees shouldn't need to decide between people they love and jobs they love. Increasingly, HR is focused on compliance tasks and even employee safety. There's no time left to help employees feel supported when they're often at their most vulnerable. We'll see employers investing much more in employee benefits, including mental well-being, mental health in the years ahead. I hope that companies like Sparrow inspire a wave of innovation that makes it easier to take better care of employees. We're lucky to be joined today by Deborah Hanus, Sparrow CEO, who turned just that vision into a successful company. Deborah, welcome to the podcast. Let's get started by having you describe your background and the founding vision behind Sparrow.
Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you for having me on the show. My background is actually in computer science and machine learning, and I was coming up on 30, and all of my close friends from college started having children, like happens to a lot of people. And I found that in this 1 6-month period, 6 of my close friends from college had children, and all of them had to go through the process of filing for short-term disability, paid family leave. All of them complained about it. All of them struggled with it. Half of them ended up actually messing things up with the process and not getting paid properly and then needing to file appeals. And I started thinking, if this is so difficult for my friends who are all, for the most part, Harvard and MIT grads with amazing jobs in tech, chances are this is a large problem for a lot of other people as well. And then in the process of that, I started looking into how companies were managing the process. And I found that the process was almost more frustrating for companies. For small to medium businesses, generally, people who start businesses are just people like you, me, or anyone else. They don't have any superhuman compliance knowledge. So for them, this is really a lot to figure out. So there are sort of 3 things that small to medium businesses are doing. One is they don't know about any of the paperwork. They don't know about that. They don't know that they could be saving a lot of money when an employee goes out on leave. A lot of small to medium businesses, either they don't know about the paperwork, so they just don't do anything with it, or they know there's paperwork that could save them some money, but they don't know how, but they don't have the time to figure it out, so they just pay the employee their whole salary while they're out on leave. Or they say, I know there's this paperwork, it would be great if we could figure it out, so I'll have the employee who's going out on leave figure it out. This is actually probably the most common, and this is what happened to all of my friends. But often in this case, what ends up happening is the employee does their best, but they're going on leave because they just had a major life event. So they actually have even less time to figure this out than anyone else. So then usually they'll end up making mistakes, not getting paid properly. And then when they go back to the company doesn't know how to fix the problem, which just makes the employee feel underappreciated. And then so that's how small to medium businesses are often managing this. And then we started looking into more how larger companies are managing the process. And we found that for small companies, generally, they're sort of not managing the process. And as such, they're offering shorter leave because they think that's all they can afford. Whereas actually most companies are eligible either through insurance or state benefits for roughly half of the employee's salary to be paid by an insurance policy. at which point they could be saving, $10,000 to $30,000 per leave. And if they think they can offer a 2-week leave, they can actually probably offer a 4 to 6 week leave. And then for larger companies, normally they're filing the paperwork and they're starting to manage the process, but it's taking them a lot of time. It takes on the order of 10 to 20 hours for someone in HR to manage one leave. And when 5 to 10% of your workforce goes out on leave every year, that means even at a 500-person company, you're probably looking at hundreds to thousands of hours per year that you're spending on this. So what Sparrow does is we just try to abstract all of that away, both for HR and the employee, and you really manage that process end to end. And because we're doing it all the time, we're able to provide a much more streamlined experience.
So I put Sparrow in a narrow cohort of companies in Silicon Valley that is doing well by doing good. To the extent you agree that that's kind of a unique domain to be in, talk us through how you use that as an asset, whether when you're fundraising or when you're hiring, the fact that you have a genuine desire to improve work life for employees and you're building a business, you identified an opportunity that relates to that.
Yeah, absolutely. That is something that was very important to me as I was working on starting Sparrow. I did want to find a way to start a company where not only is it a company where people can enjoy coming to work, but that also has largely positive impacts. And I think that Sparrow is really doing an amazing job with that, in that it is there are really no losers. HR, we help HR with a process that they never wanted to manage in the first place because it's a lot of boring paperwork. Help the employee with that process as well, providing a better employee experience. And then in the meantime, then they just pay us for the service that we're providing, so that we can keep doing it for more and more people and make it so that more and more companies can offer generous leave policies that are not only generous, but also do all of the things that you would want a leave policy to do. We find that often another way in which we are often helpful to companies is that we found that all leave policies are often a little bit broken. And I think that the reason they're broken is just that they're written by lawyers who understand all of the laws, but they don't necessarily know all of the edge cases and some of the situations that might come up in a leave policy. So a common example that we see is, if a policy uses language like maternity leave and paternity leave, you can easily end up in a situation where 2 women who have a child together might have twice as much leave as 2 men who have a child together. That's not something that anyone really wants to happen in the leave policy. It's just a situation that usually the lawyers didn't think through when they were writing the policy. So because we're looking at policies all day, every day, we're sort of able to make it so that people's leave policies take into account some of these edge cases and more unusual situations, so that as the company scales and they see more and more cases of leave, they're able to ensure that their policy does what they expect it to do. And I think that managing to create a situation in which all of the incentives are in line for both customers, Sparrow, and the employees who are helping has been very helpful, both in terms of, I think it's helpful largely for our company culture. I think it's really nice in that the team is, in some ways, the team feels a little bit like a nonprofit, in which, the nice thing about working with nonprofits is usually everyone is very, if you're working in a nonprofit, you're probably there because you really care about the mission and you want to be, and you care about the problem and you want to be making a difference. And I think that that's true of everyone on the Sparrow team right now. But unlike a nonprofit, we're also able, because we have the funding and the customers and the revenue streams in order to back that up, we're also able to make sure that we're developing really efficient processes so that we can move more like move like a nimble startup, while having the impacts of something more mission driven like a nonprofit.
Now, I'd imagine the pandemic has dramatically impacted leave behavior. I could imagine that because of increased pressures, anxieties. There's a need for more employees to be taking, I guess, call it a medical, a non-paternity leave, particularly when it comes to childcare, elder care, et cetera. And yet I imagine there's also maybe a reluctance to take the leave that they need out of concern for their job stability, company stability. What have you seen in terms of the pandemic's impact on leave behavior?
Yeah, absolutely. So there were a number of large changes, one of which was just there were a number of changes in regulations as the Families First Coronavirus Response Act came out. So that means that if people needed to take time off of work due to coronavirus activities, that's something which if you track that time, then often you can write it off later on your taxes. There are also it also has, like as you said, it has impacted the number of medical leaves. If you are quarantined due to coronavirus in a lot of states, that counts as a medical leave, even if you don't necessarily have coronavirus. And then on top of that, there are many coronavirus related cases as
In
well.
other words, if you're a non-essential worker, you're quarantined, even if your employer still expects you to work, you could take a leave because you're quarantined.
Yes, in some states. So it has definitely. So we have definitely seen an increase in leaves among our current customers, and then I think that because there have been all these changes in regulations as well, I think that we've had a lot of our customers coming to us to sort of help make sure that they understand what they need to do and help them with some of those policies surrounding that as well. So I'd say that those are probably the major changes that we've seen with coronavirus.
One of the things that I'd imagine the pandemic might have done, and you're certainly the expert here, exaggerate maybe gender imbalances when it comes to leave policies. And the thing that I'm, again, correct me, but the thing I envision is that because more often than not, females tend to be caregivers, again, more, not to overgeneralize, but two parents of any gender in the house, does the additional burden, the stress associated with being quarantined, are you seeing any evidence that it unequally or unfairly is impacting females?
Yeah, so I don't think that we've necessarily seen, and I'm not even sure we have a data set large enough to draw any conclusions from on how that is impacting things in terms of leave. I would definitely say that there is, just due to social expectations and the gender norms that are out there right now, women do often end up taking on more caregiving responsibilities. And then because of that, I think that they do often, certainly they're finding things a bit more stressful. Not if that was the situation prior to coronavirus, if you suddenly find anyone, man or woman, who finds themselves in the situation of trying to take care of small children or sick family members at the same time as working full time, is definitely going to be in a very stressful situation right now. So, and I think that is was part of the reasoning between Families First Coronavirus Response Act, was trying to make it a little bit easier for employers to be more understanding and more flexible with their employees without necessarily bearing all of the costs themselves.
Is there evidence that, again, for non-paternity, non-maternity leave, employees avoid requesting it because of either the complexity or concern for their job, or is that something that's well documented?
I think it depends a lot on what role you're in and what the company's leave policies are. I think that, I'd say one thing that is certainly true is, I'd say, even just looking at maternity leave and paternity leave, everyone, as if you're going on a maternity leave, you sort of almost have to take some sort of leave because you're recovering from a major medical procedure and it's physically extremely difficult to work for several weeks afterwards. But part of that is also, for bonding with a child, learning how to care for a child if it's your first child. And I think that there definitely is a lot of pressure, even among social pressure, even in companies where there are generous paternity leave policies. I think often there is social pressure to return to work quickly, which I think really widens the gender gap in that, really, if you have two new parents, neither one knows how to be a parent when they have their first child. And right now, a lot of policies make it so women then have maybe 8 to 12 weeks of maternity leave, at which point that's 8 to 12 weeks that they're spending learning how to be a parent. Whereas if the father only has a few weeks of leave, probably he'll spend a lot of that time. He'll just have less time to learn how to be a parent on his own. And instead, I think it sets fathers up as more sort of a helper role, as opposed to really taking the lead on raising the children, which if they then feel like a helper, someone who doesn't have the full confidence to sort of manage and fully parent their child, that's something that then is going to impact the full caregiver's role for years to come. So I do think that it is very important that companies try to provide as equal of leave as possible, so that, and generally when I'm talking generally when I advise people on this, I suggest even stacking parental leaves. Maybe take a cup. Often you don't need to take it all at once. Maybe have both of them take a week right after the child comes, and then at the end maybe have one parent finish their leave, and then have the other parent finish their leave, so that they can both really learn how to be a parent on their own and learn what that process is like, so that neither one needs to assume a helper role.
A lot of dads listening, and like me, they may have felt social pressure or career pressure when they had kids. I have two daughters, 10 and 12, to take the minimum amount of leave, either possible or independent of maybe what the law provides. Are there any policies that you'd advocate for that would change the perception, even the stigma attached to taking a paternity leave?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, whenever possible, we generally suggest that if it's financially feasible for the company, that they provide equal parental leave. So if they're providing 12 weeks of maternity leave, provide 12 weeks of paternity leave as well. Because then it not only allows fathers to take secondary caregivers to take a more active role in their child's life, and a more active role in parenting, but it also helps decrease the wage gap as well. Because, while no one likes to talk about it, there certainly is. People do still sometimes have concern that women are going to take leave and thus end up paying them less. Whereas if there's a risk that either a man or a woman might take a 3-month leave at any time, then it eliminates the reasons or the sort of bias to discriminate against women in that way.
I want to shift to Sparrow, the company now, and you as a leader. We were talking offline the other day, and you had some great advice about hiring and some of the questions in interviews that work for you. What has worked for you when it comes to building and retaining a team and in the selection process?
Yeah, absolutely. That is a very large question, which I will probably only be able to answer a small piece of. So to start off with, I think we do have a huge advantage because we are able to be mission driven. I think that a lot of people do. They really want to work. They want to be able to accomplish a lot and have a large impact. They want to like the people they work with. And they also want to feel good about what the company is doing as a whole, feel like they're contributing to something good in the world. And I think that's something that we do filter for in the interview process. And I think that it's done a lot to help the team grow into what it is. Some of the things I'd say when we're hiring, there are a few things that we look out for. One is we try to hire people who are empathetic. This is especially important for people who are helping people go through their leave, because it's really even if you're going out on leave for something good, like you just became a parent, it is a stressful time in your life where you have a lot going on. So we try to hire people who are empathetic, who are great communicators, who can sort of take complicated information and make it simple. And most importantly, we try to hire for people who are very self-aware, because it's you want people who know what they don't know. Sort of the worst case scenario is if someone doesn't know something and then they give incorrect information. Whereas if you hire someone who doesn't know something but they know to ask, then the right thing still happens. So I'd say we started out looking for those characteristics in the people who help to manage leaves for us, and we found very quickly that these are actually characteristics that we want for everyone on the team. These are characteristics we want from our engineers, and it just makes the entire team a lot more fun to work with. So I'd say that those are some of the main things that we really focus on when we're building the team.
So roll back the clock even further from hiring and retention to fundraising. Talk us through what it was like raising for Sparrow, the concept of Sparrow, in a venture community that tends to favor deep tech, and often, this may be somewhat controversial, but often themes that are better understood in a male-dominated field tend to be the ones that get funded or funded at higher valuations. What was your fundraising journey like?
Yeah, that is an interesting question. So at this point, I've raised for Sparrow twice. We were at very different stages of the company at each time. First, we raised a pre-seed round around the end of 2018. And at that point, the entire team was me. I was a solo founder, and we had a few beta customers, mostly small to medium businesses. We hadn't really gotten a lot of recurring revenue yet, but it seemed like there was some validation for the need. And that was something that I did by design. Some people asked me why I did not raise as soon as I had the idea. So I started working on the idea in July 2018, and we didn't raise until more like the end of 2018. And the reason for that was I think investors make investment decisions sort of based on team, traction, and idea. And I think I was just very honest with myself about where my idea and our Sparrow situation, how that would look to an investor. I'd say on the team, it's very certainly, like, as an individual, I look good. I went to Harvard and MIT. I have a software background, sort of like checking a lot of boxes that investors look for. But as a solo founder, you're never going to get full points, because what if you get hit by a bus and die, and really the company's dead? Just knowing that I wouldn't get full points on team, but I would probably have maybe half points on team. And in terms of the idea, I thought that it was a really good idea. I think that there's definitely, for someone who invests in B2B, I think there's a good argument for why it's a good idea. But that said, not everyone is going to understand it. Not everyone understands all of the difficulties that go into this. And so then the third thing I needed was traction. So then I did spend a few months working on getting customers right away before I decided to fundraise. I would say that there are definitely, you don't need full points on all three of these things. A team of founders with previous exits and a good story for how they're going to sell their idea. Maybe they don't need any traction. Maybe they can go in and raise funding right out of the gate. But as an unproven solo founder, I decided I needed traction. And the raise actually went relatively quickly at that point. I think largely because we weren't both. I think it was a good idea. But that said, not everyone got it. Definitely. A lot of people do not. there is certainly a type of investor, I think, that has not, if you perhaps if you have not had a salary in a long time, salary compensation, you might not even understand how difficult it can be if there is a break in pay during your leave, which is actually a huge, I would say a large part of the problems that we're solving. So not everyone got it, but it did. But I would say that the raise went well. The second time we raised, we had gotten a lot of brand name customers, and we had really good revenue traction growth. We have zero churn to date, and I think with all of those metrics, it was a little bit easier. It was a little bit easier to raise just because we had numbers to back things up. But once again, I would say it is not an idea people are used to seeing, and I do think that every investor in a meeting, I need to spend a little bit of time getting them on board with why this is a business.
So now you're coming up on 2 years, and you built clearly an amazing customer base. Congrats on zero churn to you and the team. I got to get your perspective on advice for other first-time CEOs that are kind of just now maybe ideating. What is it that you got right?
I think there are two major things that I learned in the process. One is, I think that we got lucky. I do think that to some extent, so when I started exploring ideas for Sparrow, I explored some related ideas as well. And I do think that a lot of founders, it can be very difficult. The two scarce resources you have as a founder are really morale and money. And I think that it can be very not good for morale if you spend some time getting into an idea. To some extent, you don't know how big a business is going to be until you really get into the market and really become an expert in it. And that takes time. For some people, they pick an idea that is in a market where the market size just isn't large enough. Maybe everything else about the business was great, but the market size isn't large enough. And I think that it's difficult to keep going after that if you have too many sort of false starts like that, just because it depletes your morale. I think that, and to some extent, we got a little bit lucky in that we got into this area, and the farther we get into the area, the more we're like, this is actually a much larger market than I even initially thought when we got started. So I think that was one thing that was probably point one that was really helpful. I think the second thing I learned, is that advice, a lot of the sort of standard advice that people think of as just good practice for startups, I think on some level is a little bit overfit to the data that is out there right now. Right now, the majority of founders are, of course, white men, come from a certain demographic. And I think that because 90 some founders come from that sort of demographic, that sort of background, a lot of the advice that we think of as just good advice for everyone is actually just really good advice for that demographic. And sort of the farther you get outside of that demographic, the less likely it is that advice is necessarily going to apply to you. An example of this is, I know very early when I was working on Sparrow, I definitely had a lot of pressure to just pick a co-founder. And I think that that is really good advice. Certainly, it's much easier to start a startup if you have a co-founder, just like it's much easier to parent a child if you have a good supportive relationship with a partner. But at the same time, if you don't have someone who you work very well with and who you're excited to start that process and really go in for the long haul with, but you still really want a child, for example, then probably you should take what seems like the slightly harder route. Just go ahead and have that child or start that startup.
Deborah, I know time flies by, but we're about out of time. I got to get in one last question for you. if you kind of polish your crystal ball and envision a world where Sparrow has made a dent in the universe, it's done exactly what you hoped. How is life for employees different?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would love to see all companies offering more leave. On the order, I'd say more on the order of at least like 3 to 6 months. I'd say when I talk up, people often, I think there's a sort of a misconception among employers that if you give an employee infinite leave, they will take infinite leave. But really, most people I know who have been at companies that have a longer leave, at some point they get bored. They want to go back to work because that's how people derive a lot of their self-worth and from their job. And if you enjoy your job, you do want to get back to work at some point. And really the right amount of leave is the amount of leave where the employee has reached that point where they said, okay, I've had enough time at home, and I'm ready to go back to work and find that balance. So really, ideally, I would love to see men and women having equal parental leave. I would love to see that wage gap eliminated. I would love to see an environment in which people feel comfortable and feel prepared to start a leave. I think often one thing that can sometimes factor into the process is people will just, I think sometimes, particularly when leave is handled in-house, sometimes people feel uncomfortable saying everything that they want from their leave to HR. If someone, for example, wants as much time as possible with their newborn, even if it's unpaid, that's something that not a lot of people feel comfortable saying to a colleague. So I think making it so that people can feel like they understand what they're signing up for in a leave and not need to think about the bureaucracy or these other things, and really just have whatever time they're out on leave to really focus on their family, focus on their health, focus on whatever reason they're taking leave, as opposed to needing to worry about bureaucracy and all these other things.
Fantastic. Good wisdom. I hope that as some of these trends play out, maybe you'll come back and we'll have the second version of this conversation. How's that work for you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Deborah, this has been excellent. Thank you so much for joining us. And of course, thank you all for listening. If you enjoy the podcast, again, go ahead and sign up for the newsletter. You'll get special insights from great guests like Deborah. People reign like the reign of a king.io/podcast, PODCAST. And we will be back next week with another fascinating discussion. Deborah, thanks again.